Hello and welcome to my channel. This lecture will continue our discussion about the nervous system, so let's begin. For the external features of the brain, to study the brain, we will go from bigger descriptions to smaller descriptions. Means we will start with a hemisphere and then we'll divide each hemisphere into lobes and then into areas, gyri and sulci. The brain constitutes the cerebrum, which is the cerebral hemisphere, the cerebellum, and the brain stem. The cortex of the brain, as you can see here, is thrown into gyri, these elevations, gyri, with depressions between them, sulci, gyri and sulci, and the bigger sulci are called fissures, like this one, the interhemispheric fissure. Two cerebral hemispheres separated by the interhemispheric fissure, and in the floor of this fissure, as we discussed earlier, there is the corpus callosum. Now, to describe the brain, to be oriented, this is the frontal pole, not lobe, pole, and this is the occipital pole. This is posterior and this is anterior. How to differentiate between them, especially if there is no cerebellum, if you are in a practical exam, trust me, sometimes you will be confused which is which, where is anterior and where is posterior. The frontal pole is wider and bigger than the pointed and tapering occipital pole. See that? And you mark it by the notch before the occipital pole. It's called the preoccipital notch, the notch you see here. And remember always that the temporal lobe, always like the thumb, points anterior. So this is anterior and this is posterior. The two cerebral hemispheres are separated by the interhemispheric fissure, the one you see here. This is the interhemispheric fissure. Okay, so now you divided the brain into two cerebral hemispheres. So let's, subdivide each hemisphere into lobes. When you take a look at the brain, you'll notice that all the gyri are interrupted gyri. They are not continuous, see that? Except for these two. See that? This is a gyrus, complete gyrus, and this is a complete gyrus. Now, between these complete gyruses is a sulcus. It's called the central sulcus. This is the central sulcus, and this is how you identify it. And it doesn't have to be central in the center. See, in this case, it's slightly posterior. This is the central sulcus. The brain in front of the central sulcus, this is the frontal lobe, okay, and behind the central sulcus, this is the parietal lobe. So the central sulcus separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. And there's another sulcus evident here on the lateral surface, superolateral surface of the brain, which is this one. This is the lateral sulcus that separates the frontal and parietal from the temporal lobe. So now we know where is the frontal lobe, where is the parietal lobe, and where is the temporal lobe. Now there is no mark on the superolateral surface that separates the parietal and temporal from the occipital lobes, but there is on the medial side. See, this is the medial side. There is a sulcus called the parieto-occipital sulcus, in front of which is the parietal lobe, and behind it is the occipital lobe. Back again to the superolateral surface of the brain. So now we know the lobation of the cerebrum: frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital. Okay, now to subdivide each lobe, in the frontal lobe, the first gyrus in front of the central sulcus, it's called the precentral gyrus. Okay, this is called the precentral gyrus. And you can divide the rest of the frontal lobe into superior, middle, and inferior gyri. Arc-shaped. Superior, middle, and inferior frontal gyri, with two sulci in between, the superior and inferior frontal sulci. But of course, I told you before that these are interrupted sulci and gyri. Superior frontal, middle frontal, and inferior frontal gyri, and the precentral gyrus. Now, in the parietal lobe, this is the postcentral gyrus. Okay, this is postcentral gyrus, and here you can divide them into superior and inferior parietal lobules. Superior and inferior parietal lobules, and as part of the parietal lobe, at the end of this sulcus, the supramarginal and angular gyri. Okay, the superior one belongs to the parietal lobe. The supramarginal and angular, and angular gyri. Supramarginal and angular gyri. The supramarginal is surrounds the tip of the lateral sulcus, and the angular gyrus surrounds the tip of the superior temporal sulcus. Okay. Now the temporal lobe, you can divide it into superior temporal lobe, superior temporal gyrus, middle temporal gyrus, and inferior temporal gyrus. Superior, middle, and inferior temporal gyri, with two sulci in between, the superior temporal sulcus and inferior temporal sulcus. Okay. Now the occipital lobe, it's better studied on the medial side, but when we study the areas of the visual areas, you will find that this is area 17, area 18, and area 19. We'll come to that later. Now, this is the superior view of the cerebrum. As you can see, this is the central sulcus. Now you know how to point out the central sulcus. It's the sulcus where in front and behind complete gyri. See that? So it's easily identified on the superolateral surface of the brain. This is the parietal lobe, and this is the frontal lobe, and this is the occipital lobe. Don't forget the preoccipital notch that demarcates the beginning of the occipital lobe at the superolateral surface. Okay. The inferior surface and the medial surface of the brain. Now, the inferior surface of the brain, this is the continuation of the frontal area. It's called orbital gyri and sulci. It's part of the prefrontal cortex or periorbital cortex. You can identify an H-shaped sulcus that divides them into orbital gyri and sulci. There is a straight gyrus medially. It's called the gyrus rectus, or the straight gyrus, and bounded laterally by a sulcus called the olfactory sulcus, because the olfactory sulcus has the olfactory tract in it. See, this is the olfactory tract. So we have a gyrus rectus, olfactory sulcus, and orbital gyri and sulci. Orbital because they are above the orbit. They have nothing to do with vision, just the location. orbital gyri, and sulci. This is the tip of the temporal lobe. See that? And this elevation here is called the uncus, which is the tip of the gyrus. The most medial gyrus is called the parahippocampal gyrus. The uncus is the tip of the parahippocampal gyrus, or hippocampal gyrus, because if you dig here, you will find the hippocampus. Okay, hippocampus, lateral to it is the hippocampus sulcus, and you can divide this area into medial and lateral occipitotemporal gyri. Occipitotemporal gyri. See that? Medial and lateral occipitotemporal gyri. So the inferior surface of the brain, the tip of the temporal lobe, and the uncus, the tip of the parahippocampal or hippocampal gyrus, and the medial and lateral occipitotemporal gyri. And at the front there is the orbital gyri and sulci at the frontal cortex, with a gyrus rectus medially bounded laterally by the olfactory sulcus, which has the olfactory tract in it. Medially, this is the medial surface of the brain. Now this is the frontal lobe, so this is the medial frontal gyrus. Okay, this is the cingulum here, or the cingulate gyrus with a cingulate sulcus. Cingulum means belt, because it's like a belt surrounding the corpus callosum. Cingulate gyrus with a cingulate sulcus. This is the rest of the medial frontal gyrus. Now, the tip of the central sulcus here, and anterior to it and posterior to it, anterior part is a continuation of the precentral gyrus, posterior part is a continuation of the postcentral gyrus. Okay, so it's called together paracentral lobule. Paracentral lobule. Now, this area that belongs to the parietal lobe is called the precuneus, because it's anterior to the cuneus. The cuneus is the area between the parieto-occipital sulcus and this sulcus. This sulcus is called the calcarine sulcus. Actually, there's a part here obstructed by the cerebellum. Sometimes in books you'll find this area only is called calcarine, and this is called the post-calcarine sulcus. Calcarine because the whole thing together looks like a foot of a bird. Calcarine sulcus. Now below the calcarine sulcus is this tongue-like gyrus. Is called the lingular gyrus or lingual gyrus. Okay, this is the lingual gyrus. This is the cuneus, and this is the precuneus, which belongs to the parietal lobe. This is the cingulate gyrus that surrounds the corpus callosum, and here the corpus callosum, it has the rostrum, genu, and body, and splenium, and this is a cut section of the vermis of the cerebellum, and this is the rest of the cerebellum, and this is cut section of the brain stem. Now notice that this is the cerebral aqueduct of Sylvius that connects the fourth ventricle to the third ventricle. It's the space between the two thalami. This is the thalamus. Okay, now this is the fornix. See that? This is the fornix, and underneath the fornix is the interventricular foramen of Monro that connects both lateral ventricles together. So we have the fornix, we have the interventricular foramen of Monro. This is the diencephalon, this is the pineal gland. Okay, This is the hypothalamus here and pituitary gland. This is the cut section of the midbrain with a central aqueduct of Sylvius in it. And this is the fourth ventricle, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. Okay? Okay, so this is a brief description of the external surface of the brain, the superolateral surface, the medial surface, and the inferior surfaces of the brain. Now, a scientist called Brodmann was examining the brain and taking tissue samples from different areas of the brain, and he puts it on slides, histology slides, to study. Of course, he had to number the slides. Actually, the numbering of the slides, when plotted back on the where he took the tissue from, we have the Brodmann's areas. So now you understand where the numbers came from. Actually, it's the number of the slide the tissue of this area was studied. This is the central sulcus here. The precentral gyrus is called motor area 4, or primary motor area 4. In front of it, association motor area 6 and 8. Okay, 6 and 8. We have at the frontal, at the anterior end of the frontal lobe, 9, 10, 11. This is for areas for behavior and connected to the limbic system. This is area 44, 45. Actually, this is the speech area, and in males, it's prominent on the left side, only actually on the left side, but in females, you have it on both sides, left and right side. That's why if kids in young age have a brain injury, the females have a pretty good chance to being able to talk rather than the male children with brain injury. This is called the Broca's area. Area 41 and 42 are the primary auditory area. Okay, and area 20 here, the old name of it was a silent area because its function was unknown, but now the function is known, and it's related to memory and is connected to the limbic system. Okay. Here on the occipital, on the parietal lobe, we have the primary sensory area, which is the post-central gyrus, 312, the area 312, and the association parietal or association sensory areas are areas 5 and 7, as you can see here. Okay. Areas 93 and 40 are other association areas that you can see here, and the occipital areas 17, 18, 19. On the lateral surface, they are arc-like. Area 17, area 18, area 19, but they are continuous on the medial side, both above and below the calcarine sulcus. There should be here area 17 and 17, 18 and 18, 19 and 19. See that? The 19 goes to the lateral side and continues as an arc, and continues then on the inferior side. And the same applies to areas 18 and 17. Okay. Other areas that belongs to the limbic system and the memory and behavior are as what you see here. And this is just to show you what does Brodmann's area mean. Brodmann's areas mean it's simply the numbering of the slides on which he studied the tissue samples from the brain cortex. Okay, this was a brief summary of the external features of the brain. I hope you got the maximum benefit from this lecture, and thank you very much for watching.